Judy Amesbury, and I'm an archaeologist with a company called Micronesian Archaeological Research Services. Our initials are MARS, not to be confused with MARC at the university, and we're a scientific and educational nonprofit corporation. Years and years ago, like more than 20 years ago, MARS did an excavation in Saipan at a site called Chalanpiao. And Chalanpiao is one of the oldest sites in the Marianas. It goes back to 1500 BC. That means people were living there 3,500 years ago. And at Chalanpiao, we found hundreds of small conch shell beads, about 500 small conch shell beads, and fragments of shell bracelets. But we didn't find any human remains. So we weren't able to line up, the ornaments with the people. We didn't know who would have worn those ornaments. Was it men or women that wore the ornaments in pre-contact culture? And was it only those early pre-Latte people or also people during the Latte period? Was it only the older respected people or also young people? But now there's been a site excavated here in Guam where we got the answers. The ornaments were found right on the human remains. And I'm talking about the Naton Beach site, which is at the north end of Tumon Bay. The excavation took place in 2006 to 2008. But the report was just finished in 2016 because it's a massive 3-volume report. But there were more than 400 burials recovered at Naton Beach, and that includes more than 250 people who lived during the Latte period when the Latte stones were made, and more than 150 people that lived during the earlier pre-Latte period. And archaeologists had never seen that many pre-Latte individuals before. This is just a timeline to show you the pre-Latte and Latte. All of that is the prehistoric period or the pre-contact period. And contact occurred with Magellan in AD 1521. That's the end of the timeline here. And it goes back to 1500 BC or a little earlier. So it's really not hard to remember the pre-contact period in the Marianas is about 1500 BC to about AD 1500. And it's just that yellow block at the end that's the Latte period, when the Latte stones were made. And all that earlier time is the pre-Latte period that we knew much less about. So it's not only the number of burials that was unusual, but the number of burial goods was extraordinary at this site. Archaeologists used to think that the ancient Chamorros didn't use burial goods, but that was just because we had never seen this site before. So here there were more than 1,700 beads and bracelets and other ornaments on the human remains. And the ornaments were made over a 2,000-year period. I can tell you how we know that. There were 4 radiocarbon dates obtained from beads from 4 different burials. And those all came out to about the same date of 2,500 years ago. And then we know that the most recent burial actually took place after Spanish contact because the most recent burial has a few glass beads in it, and those glass beads were made in Europe. So I'll just go through and show you the ornaments now, and the little picture in the right-hand corner shows you what kind of mollusk or whatever the ornaments were made from. Most of the pre-Latte ornaments are cone shell beads, and there's 3 types. So this particular type I called type 1 because this is the same kind we had seen at Chalanpiao, where the deposits dated to as much as 1,000 years earlier. People were making this kind of bead in the Mariana Islands for 1,000 years. And the reason there's different types of cone ornaments is because they're different species. This is the type 2 conus circlet, and at this site there was only 1 of these. So of course I wouldn't normally call one item a type, but we had seen this at early sites in Saipan, Chalanpiao and Achugao. And this one was found on a pre-Latte male who died between age 35 and 50, which means he was a pretty old man in those days. These are the type 3 cone shell beads, and this was the most numerous ornament at this site. There's more than 1,000 of these beads. They look sort of like hole reinforcements that you stick on 3-hole notebook paper. That's about the size and shape of these. And there was one woman who had more than 400 of these beads. Let's see, I'm just going to point with my hand. You can see the beads coming down here and going back up here. And you can see a little enlargement of her shoulder. And the beads on the skull were not found on the skull. It was just that the person excavating was setting the loose beads there so they wouldn't be misplaced. And you can see she also has a nice cone shell bracelet. This woman died between the age of 20 and 35, and that's actually the age that most people in this site died. Then besides the cone shell beads, there were beads of a few, or ornaments of a few other species. And these circlets, I called them, were made of Anodara shell, which is a bivalve. They sort of look like the cone shell type 2 bead, but made of a bivalve. And we didn't really know that until we looked at the ornaments under the microscope. The photo on the right shows what it looks like under the microscope. It has that Anodara pattern. And there was one woman who had cowrie shell beads. You know, this is the money cowrie. I mean, it's called the money cowrie because it was used as money in other parts of the world. And one woman had 11 cowrie shell beads. And then there was one woman who had a dozen drilled tiger shark teeth. And I think, boy, that must have been an exciting day when her boyfriend or her husband caught a tiger shark. And somebody was able to drill them and turn them into ornaments for her. I'll tell you more about that lady in a bit. There was one woman who had 3 of these big circlets made of tridacna, or HITA in Chamorro. And at first I thought they were bracelets, but I decided not to call them bracelets because they weren't on the arm like the other bracelets were. They were on the front of the woman, like on her chest or abdomen. And also they're a little too large to be bracelets. Unless somebody had extraordinarily large hands, they would slip off your hand. These are small bracelets. These are bracelets, cone shell bracelets that were found on a baby. There were bracelets made of 2 different kinds of shells, cone shell and tectus, which is something like, it's similar to trochus, which you call a liling. But these are cone shell bracelets that were found on a baby. And here is the baby. It was an infant who died between birth and age 2 months. And where you see the plastic letters ABCD, that's where the archaeologists collected beads. The baby had on a necklace of more than 100 beads and also a bracelet on each arm. There were 3 people that had these beautiful big pearl oyster shells. And unfortunately, you can see from that field photo, they don't hold together. Those kind of shells are held together by organic proteins that deteriorate through time. So the archaeologists were able to excavate them and measure them and photograph them, but when they go to pick them up, they fall apart. But the 3 people all had the pink Tata shell in the same place, sort of over the heart or over the left shoulder. So, you know, that must have meant something that they all had it in the same place. And this is the male who had the largest pink Tata shell. It was an extraordinarily large shell. Dave DeFont, who was excavating, called me and said, "Get down here, Judy. There's a shell that's, you know, a half a meter across." Well, a half a meter is 50 centimeters. It wasn't really 50, but it was 35 centimeters. And the average size is 20. So this was an extraordinarily large pink Tata shell. And the dull side is up. It's a little hard to see, but you know, you can see it looks almost like a shield around his left shoulder. And this man also had what I thought was the coolest artifact from this site, that little golf ball near his right elbow. It's a fishing weight. It's just solid tridacna, or HITA, but it has a hole drilled from each side. So that's why I think it's a fishing weight. This is the woman that had the Anodara shell necklace, and she also had a pink Tata shell, this time with the pearly side up. So in addition to those shell and shark teeth ornaments, People do other things to decorate their bodies. You know, nowadays people are interested in tattoos. We don't really think that the ancient Chamorros had tattoos because they weren't, tattoos weren't mentioned by the different explorers that came here. But there was one man who had something very unusual done to his teeth. He had apparently inlays in his teeth. His two front teeth were modified for inlays, and I can show them to you. But whatever was inlaid is missing. It must have been something valuable. Maybe somebody popped those inlays out before they buried him. There's his two front teeth. Don't try that at home. And I just put in this slide of Mayan inlaid teeth to give you an idea of what inlaid teeth look like. There's no connection at all between the ancient Chamorros and the Mayans, but I just wanted to show you what inlaid teeth look like. And then there were several burials, 11 burials, all pre-Latte, that had ochre added to their burials. Ochre is mineral coloring that comes from certain rocks that we have here in Guam. And I actually made some ochre for the booklet. If you see the photos of ochre in the booklet, I collected the rocks and pounded them with a hammer. I pounded for an hour and got about 2 tablespoons of ochre. But there were 3 males with red ochre, 4 females, and 2 burials that we don't know the sex had yellow ochre. Then 1 female had red ochre and 1 female had both red and yellow ochre. And that's the woman with the shark teeth. Here's the burial of the woman with the shark teeth. And you can see that the upper part of her body has the yellow ochre, and then her right hand and her right leg have red ochre. And that stone next to her right leg has red ochre. Maybe that's where they were pounding the rock to get the ochre, I don't know. And this woman had, besides the shark teeth, she had 2 kinds of cone shell beads, and she had a large shellfish hook and a very nifty little file made out of pumice. So she was someone very important. I'll give you some numbers. You don't have to remember all this, but you can just see that it's about 1/4 of the pre-Latte burials had ornaments, and the number of ornaments is 1,650. It's about 2 to 1, females to males, and all the way from birth to age 50. And here's what happens in the Latte. Even though there's far more Latte burials, fewer have ornaments. So it turns out to be only about 7% of the Latte burials have ornaments, and the number of ornaments is only 23. But it's still more females than males. Just with this small number, it looks like 3 to 1 females to males, and it's also age 2 to 50. So after the pre-Latte, a whole lot of things drop out. We don't see those type 2 conus circlets, the anodara or tridactylus circlets. We don't see the cypria, that's the cowrie beads. No more bracelets, no more pink Tata shells, no inlaid teeth, and no ochre. But there's a few new things in the Latte period. There's one more style of cone shell bead that I called type 4. And then, of course, there's spondylus beads and incised teeth. This is the type 4 cone shell bead, and you can tell this is made from a different species than the earlier beads because this is made from a species with a high apex. And in both of these photos, the bead on the left was found at Naton Beach, and the beads on the right were found at another site, a mile or 2 down the road. But you can see how similar they are. In fact, these 2 unfinished beads, look like they were being made in the very same way. And that's what culture is. Culture is a pattern for doing things. We don't just get up in the morning and do everything randomly. We have a culture that sort of shows us what to do. So these 9 spondylus beads were all of the spondylus beads from burials that I know for sure were Latte period. And these 9 beads came from 8 burials. And about half of the burials were adults and about half were young people, children. But it wasn't necessarily that the little beads went with the children and the big beads went with the adults. Those small beads are only about the size of a button on a baby dress, or maybe like a collar button, very small, not like the ones people wear today. There were these 5 Spondylus beads from another burial. All 5 of these beads were from one burial, but we don't really know the time period of this burial. In the field, it was originally said to be a Pre-Latte burial, but when I looked at the photos, they're not really associated with that Pre-Latte burial. So the only way we could find out for sure the time period of these beads would be to radiocarbon date one of them, and I didn't want to destroy one of them. There were still some drilled shark teeth in the latte, but they're not tiger shark. They've been tentatively identified by Brent Tibbetts as silky shark. And one was found on a male and one on a burial that the sex couldn't be determined. But this is the wildest thing. The latte period people made designs in their teeth with, they incised designs in their teeth. And you know, it was during the latte period that people chewed betel nut, and betel nut sort of stains your teeth dark, so when they incise the teeth, it really shows up. And there was all different kinds of incising, horizontal, diagonal, cross-hatched, but there were 3 burials with this intricate cross-hatching, and they were all buried close to each other. It was 2 men and 1 woman. Here's the teeth of one of the males, age 30 to 40. And this is another male. Same crosshatch pattern, but just not quite as finely executed. So I told you that there was one burial that had glass beads, and that's obviously a post-contact person because those glass beads came from Europe. And you know, those early explorers carried beads on their ship. I think Magellan carried 500 pounds of beads to trade with the people they came across. And also, Father Salvatores brought beads to Guam. So this one individual that had the glass beads is a 12-year-old. We can't say male or female. And this person also had the most Spondylus beads, 19 necklace beads and 7 great belt beads. Here's the burial. You can see the skull on the left side, and then you see ribs and arm bones, and there you see the Spondylus belt beads that say A, B, C, D. These are the necklace beads, and these are the large belt beads. These are beautiful. And these are the glass beads that the 12-year-old had, but these photographs have been taken under a microscope. So those beads are really very tiny. They're like a quarter of an inch in diameter or a quarter of an inch long. And people ask, well, what does all this mean? You know, we wish we knew. You can't actually find out now what was in the mind of a person who lived 2,500 years ago, but you know, we can make some educated guesses. And it's obvious that the ornaments beautified both the living and the dead. Some of the ornaments indicate that they were worn while the person was still alive, and some look like they hadn't been worn. So maybe people were wearing ornaments in their everyday life, but they were also maybe saving nice ornaments to bury with people. And the ornaments were probably indicators of status or wealth, either of the deceased person or the deceased person's family. And they could have been indicators of group identity, you know, the way that different gangs wear different colors, or the way that now if we see a woman wearing a Palauan money bead, we say, oh, that woman must be Palauan. And they also tell us something about social organization. Our jewelry today still tells us something about social organization too. You know, if you see a woman wearing rings on her left hand, you think, oh, she's a married woman. But, well, I'll go on to the next slide to explain what they tell us about social organization. One thing is they tell us that this type of wealth or ornamentation was more important during the pre-Latte period than the Latte period. And the distribution mainly on women shows that women held a relatively high place in society. And the fact that there were ornaments on even infants might mean that that status was not just earned, but inherited. You know, a baby wouldn't be able to set up a latte set or catch a marlin. So, you know, if the baby was buried with a lot of ornaments, it must have been based on the status of the parents. The baby had inherited status. And all of that more or less fits with what the Spanish period writers said about Chamorro society. They said that Chamorro society was divided into 2 or 3 classes, and that status was partly inherited and partly earned. I think, you know, you might, in the top 2 classes, you might be able to move up or down, but the bottom class never moved up. And we know that ancient Chamorro society was based on matrilineal clans. But I always just like to say that the Spanish period writers never saw the pre-Latte people, and they actually only saw the Latte period people at the end of the Latte period, because things changed pretty drastically after the Spanish arrived. And most of this information comes from Freycinet, who was writing, you know, almost 300 years after Magellan. Archaeologists never really knew why there was so much change from the pre-Latte to the Latte. You know, did people just get the idea to build Latte sets and they started doing it? Or did new people arrive on island? And now it's looking more and more like there were 2 different groups of people, the pre-Latte and the Latte. I don't know if you heard a talk by a man named Miguel Villar, who was here. He gave a talk at University of Guam about DNA analysis. He's the head of the genome project for National Geographic, and he had done DNA analysis of some living Chamorro people, and he was able to say that it looked like 2 different groups of people. And the first had been on island about maybe 3,500 years, and the second about 1,000 years. And also, Cherie Wolf, who was the physical anthropologist for this project, found that there was statistically significant differences in the teeth of the pre-Latte and the Latte people. You know, physical anthropologists can look at all different kinds of things about your teeth, like the pattern of your cusps and the size of your teeth. And she found statistically significant differences between the 2 groups. I don't think that the ornaments actually acted as group identity between the pre-Latte and the Latte, because I think the pre-Latte people had quit making ornaments before the Latte period people arrived. But now we can answer the question, who wears the beads? Men and women, young and old, pre-Latte and Latte, but it was mainly the pre-Latte women, because there were 20 pre-Latte female burials that had 1,300 ornaments, which is 76% of all the ornaments. I want to say thanks to all of these agencies that contributed funding for this project. I wrote a booklet, and you can get a copy of the booklet for free today. And there's a website, there's the address, natonbeachguam.com, and the display of replicas that's in the lobby. But you should go into the main exhibit today and see the real ornaments. The ornaments from Naton Beach and also from Retidian are on display now. And I'll wait to take questions until Judy gives her presentation. But I just wanted to say, contrary to rumor, there were no Sinahi found at this site. And we still don't know whether Sinahi were worn by men or women, or even if they were worn. I'll let Judy talk about that. I just realized recently that there was a Sinahi found at a Naton Beach excavation, but it was at a slightly different location at an excavation that took place over 20 years ago. And it was not found on a human burial. So as far as I know, there haven't been any Sinahi found on human remains that would tell us whether it was worn by men or women. Judy?
I always enjoy following Judy Amesbury because I'm hoping that doing this again, we've done it one time previously for the artists in preparation for FestPac, and it did generate some discussion, and I'm hoping we generate more discussion about connecting, who wears the beads and how we are interpreting and how we are creating identity symbols today. So I like the way the Chamorro rolls off the tongue. That's why I put it that way. But hapakumekelenya, what does it mean? Ialahas imananata. The meanings behind the treasures of our ancestors. Can everybody hear me? So what I'm going to do is show slides of contemporary Chamorro jewelry and ornamentation that the artists are making today, and juxtapose the photos of ancient artifacts that inspired them. The art and jewelry produced shows examples of beautiful interpretations and fine workmanship that has been inspired by the ancient artifacts. They emote a sense of cultural pride and identity for those who admire and wear them. Most of my research for this was done in the mid-1990s. I did some research for my master's degree and was able to interview a lot of the pioneers of this movement. And you will see them in much younger context as we go through here. Now, the reasons for creating the art, when I was growing up here in the 60s and 70s, there was such a lack of knowledge, and we were not being taught anything about ancient Chamorro society or the existence of ancient Chamorros. I remember in the 6th grade we were asked to put on a dance. So Miss Agigi, our principal, put us all in muumuus and gave us bamboo whisks, and one girl had Polynesian dance training, and she danced and we provided the rhythm, and that was our dance we didn't even have Chamorro Week or Chamorro Month. But I must say, growing up in Inarahan, people had a very strong sense of identity. And I always knew there was a very strong cultural continuity here, just based on the way I grew up and what I was exposed to. The pictures you see here are from the Guam Museum when it was up at Adelu, and those are the Spondylus that you see there. And then the two Sinahi that you see down below, I found when I was doing a museum search in Europe when I was getting my doctorate. And these two are about 6 inches across. They were the only Marianas artifacts I found in Europe and on display in a museum. And this was in the Berlin Museum. They're about 6 inches across. They're piers. And the pavilions had been lost. It just said they are Marianas artifacts. They did not give a name of them. I was very excited to see them, of course. In reading and trying to connect where they came from, I think they said, I read during Fritz, Governor Fritz, the German governor in Saipan, in the early 19th century, did a lot of amateur archaeology. Archaeology, yes. And he found what I think are maybe these or similar ones in a jar in a cave, and they still have the fiber connected. They were connected by a fiber. And one of the comments of the local natives upon seeing this was lisadzu, which is, necklace. So we don't know. Nobody knew. The meaning of these has been lost. Other reasons for creating art: nationalism. And again, this was the first Guam Micronesia Island Fair in 1988, I believe. Oh, this says 1994, so it wasn't the first one. I was among those who helped to organize those early fairs, and so I was right on the front line. I got to meet islanders from all over who came, and also our own islanders, our own artists. And I don't have his picture, but Angel Santos came, and they were just starting the nationalistic movement, the protest movements, but he came and was very respectful and said, we don't want to make any issues here, we just want to have a presence and to show who we are. So this was the first visible movement of the Renaissance of ancient Chamorro art. And in this picture, I don't know the second person. The first one is Paga, Danny Jackson. He's still with us. And then the middle one is John Seguenza and Cosa Nicholas. And they are still in the movement, still creating their art and making interesting progress. This one shows Cosa Nicholas a few years later, 1996, when we started sending groups to the Festival of Pacific Arts, FestPac. And this one was in American Samoa in 1996. And what struck me is he had been making, you can see a carving that he did out of stone down on the left. And then he was carving at the fair, at the festival, he was carving these shapes. And I made a comment to him. I said, they look very Polynesian. Where did you get the ideas? Did you see them here? And he went into a very detailed story of what all those symbols meant. And they were all connected to Chamorro stories. But the influence of Polynesian artistic representation is definitely obvious here. And this was, again, a beginning of our artists to start to create their own symbols, their own art. Ben Kirigua left us a long time ago, but he started making these poles, and they were, he called them tunas, which relates back to the custom of the young men, the urikau, to carry decorated sticks, staffs, to show their identity. And he did a lot of carving on them. He put, you can't see the end very well, but he was also using fishbone and so forth to make spears. You see the Spondylus inlay. So they were really getting into their art and doing very beautiful work. Again, Cosa Nicholas. And I call this Pan-Pacific ideas because as they traveled, as they interchanged with other artists, they felt free to be inspired by other designs from other cultures and to incorporate them and to somehow make them ours. And you can see he has a latte in one of the center ones, but the fish hooks are very stylized. You might say they're Pan-Polynesian or just Pan-Pacific. A lot of inlay, a lot of etching. Joe Guerrero was another one of the early pioneers, and he's still doing his work. He's does this, but he also does large sculptures. And he's very creative and inventive. And you can see the fine work of the inlays between bone and shell and wood. And he is the only artist at that time who was doing what a term we called what did we use? Lime impressed. And you can see he has etched designs, and then he has taken the lime, like the ancient Chamorros and Chamorros still do, to make a paste and then to fill up the etchings with the lime. So it's lime impressed, and that was used also in the pottery that we have seen. So here's examples of the lime press that he used. Ephod wood in his creations, and over here you can see the lime press pottery that archaeologists have found in the Latte period. Is that correct? Latte period, Judy? Pre-Latte? Frank Lizama, much younger Frank Lizama. He started as a blacksmith, and then he still is a blacksmith, but he started carving bone. And this was 1998, and he and a group of other artists called the CHamoru Crafters created some beautiful pieces of fish bone, beef bone, and all kinds of carvings. This is one by Joe Guerrero. Again, very inventive, nothing that has ever been found in archaeological digs, but he used found objects and created a dagger. And the dagger part is a fish bone, I believe, and then he has incorporated wood and wrapped it with fiber, and then he has a sheath on the left out of another piece of wood that he found. A young Jill Beneventi. She, from the beginning, said she was just looking at the beauty of nature around her. And gradually she came into the movement and used it to express her identity. But her whole focus was taking something that she can find naturally here and making something beautiful out of it. And I just wanted to show the polished spondylus. She calls them heritage icons. And from the beginning, spondylus was a very popular item used by our artists here who recreated their heritage. Going back, I was privileged to be shown these slides that Al Lizama, when he was working there was an archaeological school, and some of you may remember, very brief archaeological group of people who started a program at the University of Guam under Monty Montvocoan. And they were excavating the area in Ipao where the band shell is now located. And they came across what they called the Princess of Ipao, because she was buried, and on either side of her were what they called warriors. One of the males had a spear point buried in his shoulder. And she had huge amounts of spondylus. She had a spondylus pendant over the crown of her head. She had a kind of a sash of spondylus that went from her shoulder down across her front and back and ended at her waist. And then you can see some of the spondylus beads on the left. Then she had a spondylus belt. And although the fiber had disintegrated, there were huge spondylus discs in sets going across the front of her body, so that they think there was a kind of an apron type adornment that she was wearing when she was buried. Again, they talked about dyed teeth. It could have been from betel nut, but there is a description by an early priest, one of the first missionaries that came with San Vitores, who talked about the process of coming of age. The girls would actually lay on the beach, lay down and be fed through a funnel while they applied this black gum to their teeth for about 2 weeks. And then after it was all done, they had a party. So it was kind of a coming of age celebration of her womanhood. So that's probably what she had. The way you could tell would be the teeth would be dyed all over if they were guillemets, or in these cases, it would be only on the front. So this photo is courtesy of the Department of Parks and Rec, HPO division. And then we had some beautiful fairs down on Epal Beach for the Guam Micronesia Island fairs. And for 2 or 3 years, Cole St. Nicholas and Danny Jackson and Sinahi, his name is, he's called Sinahi, but it's been Rosario. They built huge huts. It was a wonderful place to visit, but we just couldn't keep it up, so they had to go down eventually. But look at all the ornamentation that they have. They've put on all their splendid body ornamentation that dates them back or makes them feel identified with their ancestors. Another movement early on, I used to visit Phil Alcon in his little shop in CHamoru Village, and a bunch of artists would get together and they do sketches or charcoal drawings. This was done by Joe Garrido, who now works for Parks and Rec. They would take a Chamorro whose face reminded them of maybe an ancient chief, and they would sketch them, draw them, and give them a name. So that was Aguaren, and I'm not sure who this one was. I think they eventually made a calendar of it. The Valoria brothers, they are still very active up at the center up above the Hilton. Spondylus, again, they just do beautiful work with spondylus. And they say they were worn as a sign of wealth and high status, according to Lebec. And I think they've done an excellent job. They have a kind of a museum up there. You get up to the Second Cultura tomorrow up there, where they display these things. Cave drawings have had an influence, and on the left, I was given this picture by Al Rizama, and it relates to what we call Gada figures in the cave down in Arahan, which has come to be known as Gada's Cave. So that's become a real symbol of Chamorro identity, and you can see other symbols that are used less, but this particular symbol has become really an icon of Chamorro culture. Ben Sinahi del Rosario when he first started out, and this was the group that Phil Alcon and Joe Garrido and Al Rizama and all of them would get together, and they gave him that name Sinahi because as they shape the Sinahi, the final step is to drill the holes at the two ends for the cord to go through, and that's also the time when it can break very easily. So he was the most successful in being able to do these Sinahi and successfully drill these holes without breaking all that work that was done. Again, these are the ones that I was talking about earlier. 1904, that was the date. They were tied together and stored in a pot inside a cave. As far as I know, it's still on display at the Berlin Museum of Folk Art. And it's from the Hema clan. But what intrigues me is never have I seen in all my research any reference by an outsider to seeing the Sinahi. So So where were they? When were people using them? Because they talked about the turtle shell, the value of that. They talked about the Spondylus and how that was used. But they're silent on the Sanni. Where was it? When was it used? And this is still a question. We can look to other Pacific societies and try to understand what this object may have been used for. In Polynesian societies, the whale's tooth, and they'll polish and carve a whale's tooth, and then they put drill a hole through the top and put human hair braids, very intricate braids, and they become very important exchange wealth. When they have a burial or a wedding or an exchange between clans, they would use that. So if they were found here in a jar, that kind of gives me an idea that they were wealth and they were stored away for important purposes. That's just my theory. And I really like people to look at this and think about it and talk about it. So Joe Guerrero, again, he does one-of-a-kind art pieces, and he has also done Sanni. Then I have what we call evolved traditional art to fine art. Ray Torredo came back, he was a Marine, retired, came back here and really got into the carving of art. And he carved in wood, but then he actually found a source, went to India, and had his carving cast in bronze. And he was the first one to go to that length, to do those kind of carvings. And then on the right we have Phil Sablon, who's moved from various types of art to express his connections. He started out as a weaver, and he was the first weaver to sculpt figures and shapes and fish and everything from coconut leaf. So he was early on known for that, and then he moved on to carving of stone, and he just keeps moving. He's into tattoo now, has his own tattoo shop. Greg Pangilinan, he was recently awarded Master of Traditional Art in Carving. And he started out with bone carving. He was one of the first. So again, he still continues, and now his son is continuing. So they are passing it on. And just a plug for CAHA, that's what we are trying to do for the CAHA grant funding, is to make sure that these masters and practitioners are passing on what they know so that we can move it forward. Again, George Francisco started carving in the States, influenced by, he told me, the Native Americans. And then I have watched him over many years now, becoming more and more intricate, more and more into his heritage depiction. And these are some of the ones that he did. And just more scenes of Ben Del Rosario, and you can see huge amounts of Spondylus. These I thought were very beautiful inlays. Oops. And more combs and others inlays. Use of fiber to string together the Spondylus. Okay, so this is a brief overview of the artistic production since the 1970s. And it shows that the makers of CHamoru Heritage Jewelry have progressed in their artistic skills to a level that can compare favorably with indigenous artists everywhere. And I think we've proven that through the last, through our hosting of FestPac here. They emote a sense of cultural pride and identity for those who admire and wear them. And it's the nature of artists to be inspired by ideas and to express their inspirations with ever-increasing levels of skill and creative ingenuity. And artists, by their creative nature, exceed boundaries set by historical, archaeological, geographical, and many other parameters. Artistically, this is acceptable and even expected. The question each artist must answer for themselves is, what is my artistic goal? For those who strive to represent their indigenous heritage, certain parameters need to be set. Authentic heritage art needs to be beautiful and inspirational, but it also entails the responsibility of knowing and sharing the historical significance behind the art. And kudos to Monica when she led us in the pre-planning for FestPac. We went through a lot of workshops to try to make sure the artists understood the historical significance behind the art. So what can we say about Spondylus based on historical observations? An example would be ancient Chamorro society. They say mostly women wore Spondylus. Today, both men and women proudly wear it as a symbol of Chamorro heritage. What can we say about Sanni? An example would be, we don't know how our ancestors used the objects we call Sanni today. We do know that it was so valuable that no outsider ever reported seeing it. Today we respect the high artistic skill of our ancestors who made the Sanni by wearing it proudly as a symbol of our Chamorro heritage. In conclusion, let us honor our historians and encourage them to keep sharing their research. Let us honor our archaeologists and encourage them to respectfully continue uncovering our past and to share their findings with us. And let us promote our heritage through artistic creation based on this shared.
Are there tools discovered in various sites that were used to carve the key, bore holes through these beads? First question. The second question is, what material was used to tie the beads together?
There were some tools that were probably used to carve the beads or to drill holes in them. There was that pumice file that I mentioned that was buried with the shark tooth lady, and there were a few pieces of coral that had been used as drills. You can see that the end of the coral has been worn smoother and narrower than the rest of the piece of the coral. And there may have been sea urchin spines. We find sea urchin spines that were probably used as files in these early sites. What was the second question? Oh, what kind of material was used to string the beads? Okay. Some natural material that disintegrates because we don't find them strung together. So it was either plant material or possibly, as Judy mentioned, human hair.
After this can be addressed by either of you. My question is, aside from the jar that was discovered inside Tata that held the two examples of Sanni, what other have you found other Sannis on other items in Marianas?
I think that's your question.
Yes. I was just recently contracted by another company to analyze some artifacts from northern Guam, and there was a Sanni that was found on the surface of the ground in northern Guam. And an interesting thing was it didn't have the holes drilled in the ends. So I'm not sure if that means it just wasn't finished, but it was a beautiful Sanni, and it seemed unusual to me because one end was pointed and the other end was rounded. And then I read a website by a man named Rudolph Villaverde, who I've never met. And Rudolph Villaverde says that Sanni had one pointed end and one rounded end. So I'm not sure how he learned that information. But the one Sanahi I saw recently had a pointed in and a rounded in. But otherwise, I only know of, I think, 3 Sanahi found in archaeological excavations, and one was at Naton Beach, but at an earlier excavation over 20 years ago. And none of those 3 Sanahi were found on people, so yeah, we don't really know if they were worn or not.
Okay, you showed pictures of the Tata shells that were worn over the heart of the left shoulder. Has there been any suggested connection between those and the depiction of the circle above the left arm on the got out cave drawings?
Good point.
Can I answer that?
I don't.
I've never heard anyone make that comparison, but that's interesting, yeah.
Very good point.
Thanks, Judy Amesbury. That was really interesting. The corner shell, I think this question is more for you, Judy Amesbury. The corner shells that were found in the Marianas are very similar to shells that are still being used in the Caroline Islands for belts. And I was wondering if there was any evidence of trade in beads between the Marianas and the Carolines.
We did excavate Carolinian burials in Tamuning. You know, Tamuning was a Carolinian settlement, in the maybe like late 1800s. And there were people buried in Tamuning with a lot of glass beads. I analyzed, a couple thousand glass beads from 2 burials. But I don't remember that they had cone shell beads.
Has anyone looked into the possibility of perhaps repatriating the items found at the German Folk Art Museum and bringing it back to Guam?
That's a good question. I don't know if anybody has. The only other item we found was in a folk museum in Paris in the reserves. They let us go down into the reserve section, and we found a poem, the stone sinker cut in half with the where they put a half coconut shell over it, and it's a sinker that trains the fish, the bottom fish, to come up, and then they scoop them up with a net. So we found that, and I don't think they knew what it was. But yes, that's a good question. I don't think anybody has asked for repatriating those items.
For Dave, I just recently relocated from Saipan, and I've been in Saipan for about 26 years, and I noticed there was no Spondylus jewelry per se when I first got there. So it's really a very recent phenomenon that you see all the youth who have started creating jewelry. I would say in the last 10 years, perhaps. I mean, I don't recall seeing hardly any of it. And then it's become really very, very popular. And I remember seeing, I don't know their names, but some of the artists, obviously, that were depicted today that were coming over for Flame Tree festivals and showing a lot of their art. So when I came here, I really anticipated that there was a much larger movement on Guam with the youth and other people. And I believe it's probably tied into these archaeological discoveries, so they're tying, they're reconnecting with their cultural history. But I'm just curious why, if you have any idea. I don't seem to see a lot of it here, other than perhaps with the artists themselves. Where in Saipan, all the youth everywhere seem to be wearing it.
I see it everywhere. I mean, everybody has a sinahe of some shape, among the youth. It's very prevalent here. And I think it's maybe the circles you go into. If there's anything, I mean, just a party, a fiesta, and just go look around and see how many people are wearing this and that. It's really become an important symbol. And again, the Spondylus. I guess I'm just thinking population-wise, I think we have more of it here than Saipan just because of our larger population. But I think there's been enough exchange to where they're on an equal footing now. I think the CHamoru's here as well as the CHamoru's in Saipan as far as representing their heritage.
What, if anything, is there in concern with the laws? I remember when I came through wearing one that I was actually approached in the airport, and the customs gentleman asked me where I had gotten it. Is it acceptable here in terms of, or is there certain licensing required in order to collect or use it for jewelry purposes?
Do you want to address that? I know that, you know, we don't want, whether you're an archaeologist or a historian, or, you know, we want to protect the where it was discovered and its in situ information that is lost when people take things. So I don't know why, if that was questioned, or the material being used, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I know that a lot, in some cases, stalactites from caves are being destroyed because they want that material. So those are the issues that we have to look at now.
I can't understand why someone at the airport would have questioned you unless they thought that you were wearing something that was an endangered species. But as far as I know, Spondylus isn't an endangered species. So, but Judy's right. We don't like to see artifacts taken from sites because, you know, when people do that, there are some collectors that have beautiful collections, but they lose the information. They lose the context if they don't, you know where it came from any longer, or they didn't have an archaeologist present to recover as much information as possible.
Were there any sites where Naton Beach was found?
Naton Beach, the large turtle shell gets large discs and goes down to the very small ones.
You know, I've never heard of that on Guam because, for one thing, tortoise shell doesn't last as well. And
The Spondylus.
oh, Spondylus, like the one on display in the museum.
Yeah, Dr. Cunningham did a little booklet where he talks about Naton Beach, and I was gifted with one. And sometimes I wear it, but I've never seen or had anybody find or discuss it that was really found in any sites. So I'm trying to figure out where the name came from and whether or not there's a historical or archaeological basis.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't know the CHamoru term you were using, but I don't know of anything like that found in an archaeological excavation. Monica, where did that string of Spondylus come from that's on display in the museum now? Do you know? Is that an ancient thing or a modern thing?
It's a replica, and it was produced by George Francisco, and he said it was really rough.
A similar design
I don't recall, I could be wrong, but I don't recall Cunningham's research talking about the Naton Beach being made out of Spondylus. Is that what he has in his book? Oh. Okay, that's
Not-
news.
Not in this book, but maybe it was because it was a photo stat. Talk about being old photos. It's a photocopy of a page from somewhere. Because when I was given the gift, I was given the description of the little pamphlet that Larry had produced, where he has the Guam from the Guam.
Yeah, I think I've seen that one, and that comes from the Freycinet illustrations. But it was described as this turtle shell, so maybe the Spondylus is a way of reproducing that, because of course we can't use turtle shell.
I have heard that there were tortoiseshell ornaments found in Saipan recently, for the excavation for the casino. I don't know, I haven't seen them, but I heard there was tortoiseshell involved there.
Anybody have any more questions or comments?
Where is Naton Beach?
Oh, that's the north end of Tumon Bay. And actually, there's been 3 excavations over a long period of time at Outrigger, Weston, and Okura. So that end of Tumon Bay.
It's okay, I don't even know.
These 2 excavation sites, do they extend all the way over to Gun Beach and up against the cliff there?
Where's Darlene?
I'm sorry?
I'm looking for Darlene Moore. She would be able to answer.
She left.
Oh, okay. There has been some archaeological work there, but I don't think much. I can't say anything about it. I don't know about it. Yeah.
Are there plans for any archaeological work in there? Or?
If somebody does a development, it's required by law to do archaeology, and that's been the case, since about the 1970s. We never actually expected to earn a living as archaeologists, but since about the 1970s, laws were passed saying that if you're getting ready to develop your land, you have to find out if there's sites on it, and if there's sites on it, you might be required to pay for an excavation unless you can somehow avoid the cultural deposits by moving your building to a different part of the lot or something like that. So you've probably heard the same rumors we've heard, that there's going to be a Chinese development up there, and all I can say is that will be time consuming because they need a lot of infrastructure and a lot of archaeology, and
That would probably be a very archaeologically rich area, would it not? I mean,
Yes.
people had to have lived there
yes.
since forever.
Any more questions?